It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind where the streets carried a soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional wail of sirens in the background. Officer Ben and his partner, Officer Chris, had been patrolling for hours, scanning the roads for any sign of trouble. The night had been mostly uneventful, just a few minor traffic violations and a routine welfare check. As they cruised down the highway, a sleek black luxury sedan sped past them, weaving between cars with reckless abandon. The car had no visible license plate, and the tinted windows were so dark that not even the faintest shadow could be seen inside. Ben exchanged a glance with Chris, who nodded in silent agreement. "That one's asking for trouble," Ben muttered, flipping on the siren and pressing the gas pedal. The sedan didn't slow down immediately. Instead, it maintained its speed for several more seconds before finally pulling over onto the shoulder. The hesitation was unusual. Most drivers would stop the moment they saw flashing lights in their rearview mirror. Chris grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, we've got a black sedan, no visible plates, failure to yield initially. Pulling over now, requesting vehicle check." A few moments later, the response crackled through. "Copy that, officers. No immediate alerts on similar vehicle descriptions. Proceed with caution." Ben and Chris stepped out of the patrol car, their hands resting near their holsters, not out of aggression, but out of habit. They had been on the force long enough to know that even the most routine traffic stops could take an unexpected turn. Ben took the lead, approaching the driver's side window while Chris stayed slightly behind, keeping an eye on the surroundings. Ben tapped on the glass. "Sir, please roll down your window." There was a pause, and then, with deliberate slowness, the window slid down just enough to reveal a well-groomed man in an expensive suit. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes. An unreadable confidence that made Ben uneasy. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his tone smooth and almost condescending. "Yes, sir," Ben replied, keeping his voice firm but polite. "You were speeding and weaving between cars. Also, your vehicle has no visible plates. May I see your driver's license and registration?" The man exhaled slowly, as if dealing with an inconvenience beneath him. He reached into his jacket, and for a split second, both officers tensed. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a sleek leather wallet and handed over his license. Ben took a look at the name and nearly did a double take. The name on the card wasn't just familiar, it belonged to someone high up in law enforcement. Not just any officer. Chris leaned over slightly. "Ben, is that who I think it is?" Ben nodded slowly. The man sitting before them was none other than the head of Internal Affairs, the department responsible for investigating police misconduct. A heavy silence settled between them. "You know who I am, don't you?" the man asked, a slight smirk playing at his lips. Ben kept his face neutral. "Yes, sir. But that doesn't change the fact that you were driving recklessly. We'll still need to check your registration and insurance." The smirk faded slightly. The man sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "You two are new, aren't you?" Chris stiffened. "No, sir. We've been on the force for years." "Then you should know how things work," the man said, leaning back into his seat. "There's no need to make this into an issue. Just let me be on my way." Ben exchanged a look with Chris. They both knew what was happening. The silent expectation, the unspoken pressure. Let this slide. Look the other way. Forget this ever happened. Ben's fingers tightened slightly around the license. His stomach twisted. He had heard stories about corruption, about officers bending the rules for those in power. But standing here, experiencing it firsthand, it felt different. Chris shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we have procedures to follow. We need to verify everything before we can let you go." The man let out a low chuckle. "And if I don't feel like waiting?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, something almost threatening. Ben felt his pulse quicken. He had always believed in doing the right thing, in upholding the law no matter who was involved. But what if this was bigger than just a traffic stop? What if crossing the wrong person had consequences? The radio crackled again. "Officers, do you require backup?" Chris hesitated before pressing the button. "Negative for now, dispatch. We're handling it." The man sighed again, this time with a hint of amusement. "Look, officers. You're both good at what you do. But let me give you a little advice. There are battles worth fighting, and there are battles that just make your life difficult." Ben met his gaze. "And what do you suggest?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I suggest you think carefully about your next move." Another silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Ben could feel Chris watching him, waiting for his decision. The air between them grew heavy. The man in the car, this high-ranking officer, stared at Ben, his jaw tightening. For the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. He hadn't expected this. "You're making a mistake," the man said, his voice lower now, carrying a warning. Ben didn't flinch. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Chris stood a step behind, his posture tense but firm. He wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but he trusted Ben's instincts. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. The man remained seated, tapping his fingers against the leather steering wheel. Then, with a slow, measured motion, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open. Ben took a step back, one hand hovering near his holster, not out of fear, but out of caution. He had no idea what this man was capable of. The man stood up, adjusting his suit jacket as he looked at both officers. He was taller than expected, his presence intimidating. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked again, but this time, the arrogance in his voice was laced with something else, frustration. Ben held up the license. "Sir, you were speeding, weaving through traffic, and driving a vehicle without plates. We need to follow standard procedure." The man scoffed. "Standard procedure? You realize who I am, right?" Chris spoke up for the first time. "With all due respect, sir, that doesn't mean the law doesn't apply to you." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even anger, crossed the man's face. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his neatly trimmed hair. "You boys are ambitious, I'll give you that." Ben ignored the remark. "Sir, do you have your vehicle registration and proof of insurance?" The man tilted his head slightly. "In the glove compartment." Ben nodded. "Chris, can you retrieve it?" Chris moved carefully around the car and opened the passenger side door. The glove compartment clicked open, and inside, neatly placed, were a few documents. He pulled them out, glancing over them before handing them to Ben. Ben studied the registration. The name matched, but something was off. His eyes narrowed. "Sir, this registration is expired." Silence. The man's expression didn't change, but Ben caught the subtle tightening of his jaw. "It must be a mistake," the man said casually. Ben shook his head. "I'm afraid we'll have to issue a citation. Also, due to the missing plates, we need to verify that this vehicle isn't stolen." The man's fingers curled slightly at his sides. He took a slow breath. "You think I'm driving a stolen car?" His tone was calm, but there was a sharpness behind it. "We're just following protocol," Chris said. The man let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You're really doing this, huh?" Ben met his gaze. "Yes, sir." The man's eyes darkened. "Fine. But you should know. This will not end well for you." Chris shifted uneasily. Ben, however, remained steady. "Sir, please turn around and place your hands on the car," Ben instructed. The man's expression turned to disbelief. "Excuse me?" Ben didn't waver. "Until we verify everything, we need to conduct a routine search for any illegal items in the vehicle." The man let out a slow breath. "This is a bad idea, officer." Ben's grip on his notepad tightened, but he didn't back down. Chris, sensing the tension rising, reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we may need additional officers at our location." The radio crackled, and the response was swift. "Copy that. Sending backup now." The man sighed, then, surprisingly, placed his hands on the vehicle. But there was something unnerving about how calm he was. Ben patted him down, his hands moving quickly but carefully. There was nothing unusual, just a phone, a wallet, and a set of keys. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke. "You know, this could have been avoided." Chris looked at Ben. Ben didn't react. "You boys are making enemies in the wrong places," the man continued. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." A chill ran through Chris. Ben, however, stayed focused. "Sir, please remain where you are." The distant sound of sirens filled the air. Backup was arriving. The man let out another quiet laugh. "Let's see how this plays out." Ben knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not even close. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the tense silence. The high-ranking officer remained still, his hands resting on the roof of his expensive car, but his posture was eerily relaxed. His confidence hadn't wavered. If anything, he looked amused. Chris felt his pulse quicken. Something about this wasn't right. Most people would be nervous, maybe even angry, but this man, he almost seemed to be enjoying the situation. Ben stayed focused. He had been in the force long enough to know when someone was playing mind games. And right now, this man was testing them. Within moments, 2 patrol cars rolled up behind them, red and blue lights flashing. The backup officers stepped out quickly, surveying the scene. One of them, a tall officer with a stern face, walked toward Ben. "What's the situation?" the officer asked. Ben kept his eyes on the man in front of him as he spoke. "We pulled him over for reckless driving. No plates. Expired registration. He refused to comply at first." The backup officer frowned. "Who is he?" Before Ben could answer, the man finally spoke. "Maybe you should ask your supervisor." There was an eerie confidence in his voice. The backup officer hesitated for just a moment before glancing at Ben. "I'll call it in." As the officer walked back to his car, Ben noticed something, the smallest smirk on the man's face. Then it happened. A black SUV pulled up to the scene, rolling to a slow stop. The doors opened, and 2 men in suits stepped out. They moved with authority, their eyes scanning the situation. Ben's gut tightened. This wasn't normal. One of the men, an older gentleman with silver hair, walked straight toward them. He barely spared Ben and Chris a glance before addressing the man against the car. "Sir, are you all right?" The man finally moved, lowering his hands and straightening his jacket. "I'm fine. But these 2 seem to think they can waste my time." The older man's gaze finally landed on Ben. "Do you know who this is, officer?" Ben stood his ground. "With all due respect, sir, no one is above the law. He was driving recklessly and had an expired registration." The silver-haired man didn't seem impressed. He let out a sigh and pulled out a badge from inside his jacket. It was from Internal Affairs. Chris felt his stomach drop. Ben's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the moment shake him. He had done nothing wrong. The IA officer turned back to the man they had pulled over. "Would you like us to handle this, sir?" The man smirked. "Oh, I think these officers have already made their decision." Ben clenched his fists. He didn't like this. The IA officer sighed and turned back to Ben. You do realize you just pulled over one of the highest-ranking officers in this department, don't you? Chris swallowed hard. Ben didn't move. I realize that, sir. But that doesn't change the fact that he was violating traffic laws. The IA officer studied him for a long moment. Then, instead of responding, he turned to the other backup officers. We'll take it from here. Ben knew what that meant. The backup officers hesitated, then slowly nodded, stepping back. Chris shot Ben a nervous glance. Ben. But Ben wasn't backing down. I'd like to keep this on record, he said firmly. The IA officer raised a brow. Excuse me? Ben met his gaze. I'd like to file an official report of this stop, including all details and footage from our body cams. For the first time, the silver-haired man looked slightly irritated. That won't be necessary. Ben stood his ground. With all due respect, sir, I believe it is. A tense silence followed. The man they had pulled over let out a low chuckle. You've got guts, officer. I'll give you that. Ben didn't respond. The IA officer exhaled. Fine. But I suggest you be very careful about what you put in that report. Ben knew a warning when he heard one. Chris shifted uncomfortably, but he knew there was no turning back now. The IA officers escorted the man back to his car, speaking to him in hushed voices. Moments later, he got in and drove away, this time, at a legal speed. As the SUV pulled away as well, Chris let out a breath. Ben. What the hell did we just get ourselves into? Ben shook his head. I don't know. But something tells me this isn't over. Chris didn't argue. Somewhere deep down, he had the same feeling. And he was right. Because what happened next would change everything. The streetlights flickered as Ben and Chris drove back to the station, their cruiser cutting through the quiet of the night. The tension from the traffic stop still lingered between them. Chris gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, his jaw set in a hard line. We just pulled over one of the highest-ranking officers in the department, Chris muttered, shaking his head. That wasn't just any cop, Ben. That was, I know who he was, Ben interrupted, his voice steady. And I don't care. The law applies to everyone. Chris sighed. Yeah. Try explaining that when internal affairs starts breathing down our necks. Ben knew Chris was right. There would be consequences. But he also knew that backing down now would mean giving up on everything he believed in. The station was unusually quiet when they arrived. Most officers were either out on patrol or wrapping up reports. But the moment they walked in, something felt off. Captain Reynolds stood near the front desk, arms crossed, a deep frown on his face. Inside. Now, he ordered, jerking his head toward his office. Chris and Ben exchanged glances before following him in. The moment the door closed, Reynolds rounded on them. What the hell were you two thinking? Ben remained calm. Sir, we were just doing our jobs. The driver was speeding recklessly and had no plates. He refused to comply. Reynolds pinched the bridge of his nose. Do you have any idea who that man was? Chris sighed. Internal Affairs made that pretty clear, Captain. Reynolds shook his head. He's not just any high-ranking officer. That was Deputy Commissioner Graves. He's got connections all over the department. Ben stayed firm. That doesn't put him above the law, sir. Reynolds let out a sharp laugh. That's a nice idea, Ben. But in the real world? Things don't work that way. Chris shifted uncomfortably, but Ben held his ground. With all due respect, sir, I'd like to file a report about the incident, Ben said. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. Do you know what you're asking for? Filing a report on Graves is like throwing yourself into a fire. IA will come down on you hard. They'll look into every case you've ever worked on, every mistake you've ever made. They'll make your life hell. Ben didn't flinch. If that's what it takes to do the right thing, then so be it. Reynolds studied him for a long moment before sighing. All right, Officer Carter. But don't say I didn't warn you. Chris groaned, rubbing his temples. Ben, man. You really don't know when to quit. Ben just shrugged. The captain pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. Write your statement. But keep in mind, if Graves wants payback, I won't be able to protect you. Ben nodded, picking up the pen. As he wrote, Chris paced the room. Ben, I just don't get it. Why push this? Even if we're right, guys like Graves don't lose. Ben glanced up. Maybe. But what happens if we don't push back? What kind of cops would that make us? Chris didn't have an answer. Once Ben finished the report, Reynolds took it and leaned back in his chair. All right. You two are off duty for the next 48 hours. Take the time, clear your heads. And Ben, watch your back. Ben nodded, but he knew it was already too late for that. The next morning, Ben woke up to a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Hello? A deep voice responded, calm and deliberate. Officer Carter. It's in your best interest to let this go. Ben sat up in bed, instantly alert. Who is this? A small chuckle. Consider this a friendly warning. Drop the report. Move on. Ben's grip tightened on the phone. Or what? The line went dead. Ben exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had expected pushback, but this? Someone had gone out of their way to make sure he knew he was being watched. He wasn't scared. But he was angry. Chris was waiting for him when he arrived at the diner later that morning. You look like hell, Chris said, sipping his coffee. Got a call, Ben muttered. Chris raised an eyebrow. From who? No idea. But they want me to drop this. Chris sighed, running a hand through his hair. Of course they do. I told you, man. Graves has people everywhere. Ben sat down, rubbing his temples. If they think a phone call is enough to scare me off, they're wrong. Chris shook his head. I swear, you have a death wish. Just then, their waitress approached, placing their food on the table. But as she did, she gave Ben a nervous glance. Officer, she whispered. Ben looked up. Yeah? She hesitated before sliding something onto the table. A small folded piece of paper. Ben frowned, unfolding it. 3 words were written inside. You're being watched. Ben and Chris exchanged glances. This was bigger than they thought. And they were running out of time. Ben sat frozen, staring at the note in his hand. The message was clear, someone was watching him, and they weren't afraid to make it known. Across the table, Chris leaned in, his expression serious. This is bad, Ben, Chris said in a low voice. They're not just warning you anymore. This means they know where you are, what you're doing, and that waitress? She's scared. Ben exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Yeah. I can see that. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. We need to figure out who's behind this. Chris leaned back, rubbing his temples. Come on, man. Do we really need to? We already know it's Graves and his people. This isn't just some random threat. He's pulling strings, making sure you back off. Ben's fists clenched. That just makes me more sure that I can't let this go. Chris groaned. Of course you'd say that. Ben ignored him and turned to the waitress, who was nervously refilling a coffee cup at another table. She kept glancing at them, as if she was afraid to be seen talking to them. Ben waved her over. "Hey," he said gently as she approached. "Who gave you this note?" The young woman hesitated, looking around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "I don't know his name. He came in earlier, sat at the counter. Paid in cash. But, something about him felt off." Ben nodded. "What did he look like?" She swallowed hard. "Tall, older, maybe late 40s. Had this sharp suit, but it was the way he looked at me, like he already knew I'd do what he wanted." Ben and Chris exchanged glances. That didn't sound like Graves. "Did he say anything?" Ben asked. The waitress hesitated, then nodded. "Just one thing, before he left. He said, 'Tell your cop friend to stay in his lane. It's for his own good.'" Ben's jaw tightened. Chris sighed. "This just keeps getting worse." Ben stood. "Thanks for telling us." The waitress nodded quickly and rushed away, clearly afraid. Chris grabbed his jacket. "Okay, so we've got someone else involved. Great. That's exactly what we needed." Ben ignored the sarcasm. "We need to dig deeper. Graves is powerful, but if he has people like this working for him, it means there's something bigger going on." Chris frowned. "I hate that you're probably right." Ben didn't waste any time. By the afternoon, he was at the Internal Affairs office, handing over a copy of his report to Officer Delgado, an investigator known for being thorough but fair. Delgado read through it, then looked up at Ben. "You're putting yourself in a dangerous spot, Carter." Ben folded his arms. "That's not going to stop me." Delgado studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. I'll look into it. But don't expect quick results. Cases like this take time." Ben nodded. "I understand." Delgado sighed. "And in the meantime, you should be careful. Officers who go after the wrong people, well, let's just say, things tend to go badly for them." Ben smirked. "Yeah, I got that message loud and clear." That night, Ben decided to take the long way home, hoping to clear his head. The streets were quiet, only the occasional car passing by. But as he neared an intersection, his instincts flared. A black SUV had been behind him for the past few turns. He slowed down slightly, watching through the rearview mirror. The SUV matched his speed. Ben's pulse quickened. Then, without warning, the SUV's headlights flashed once, then twice. A signal. Ben tightened his grip on the wheel. He had been a cop long enough to know when something wasn't right. Then, the SUV sped up, pulling alongside him. The tinted window rolled down just enough for Ben to see the shadowy figure inside. A voice called out, deep and controlled. "Turn back, Carter. This is your last chance." Ben didn't reply. He kept his focus on the road. Then, the SUV swerved, forcing Ben to slam his brakes to avoid a collision. By the time he recovered, the vehicle had disappeared down a side street. Ben sat there, gripping the wheel, his breath coming in short bursts. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a warning shot. The next morning, Chris stormed into Ben's apartment, fuming. "I heard what happened last night," he shouted. "Are you out of your damn mind? They could have killed you." Ben, who was sipping his morning coffee, simply raised an eyebrow. "But they didn't." Chris threw his hands up. "That's your response? They didn't?" Ben set his mug down. "Chris, if I stop now, I might as well hand in my badge." Chris shook his head. "You don't get it, do you? You're playing with fire, and you don't even know who's holding the match." Ben sighed. I get it. I do. But if we don't stand up now, when will we? Chris exhaled, running a hand down his face. Man. I swear, you're impossible. But despite his frustration, Chris didn't walk away. Because deep down, he knew Ben was right. And that scared him more than anything. Ben knew he was running out of time. The threats weren't just warnings anymore, they were promises. Someone wanted him silenced, and they weren't afraid to get aggressive. But if they thought he would back down, they didn't know him at all. Chris was pacing in Ben's apartment, his frustration clear. "This is insane, man," Chris muttered, rubbing his temples. "They tried to run you off the road. What's next? A bullet in the back?" Ben remained calm, checking his gun before holstering it. "I don't plan on giving them the chance." Chris stopped and looked at him. "So what's the plan, then? You just keep pushing until they decide to take you out?" Ben turned to his old friend. "I need to get to Graves. He's the key to all of this. But he's protected. I need leverage." Chris sighed. "And how do you plan on getting that?" Ben pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "I have one last shot. Delgado at Internal Affairs said he'd look into it, but I know that'll take too long. I need something now." Chris frowned. "And what exactly are you looking for?" Ben took a deep breath. "Evidence. Hard proof that Graves is dirty." Chris scoffed. "Yeah, good luck with that." But Ben had already made his decision. Late that night, Ben found himself parked outside an old warehouse, a storage facility known to be used by certain officers for unofficial purposes. If Graves was hiding anything, this was where it would be. Chris was in the passenger seat, shaking his head. "I can't believe I let you drag me into this." Ben smirked. "You could have stayed home." Chris scoffed. "Yeah, and let you get yourself killed? Not a chance." Ben reached under his seat, pulling out a crowbar. "Then let's make this quick." The warehouse was mostly dark, except for a single security light flickering at the entrance. No guards, no patrol cars, just silence. Ben and Chris moved carefully, sticking to the shadows. The side door was locked, but one strong pull with the crowbar, and it popped open with a soft click. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing slightly. "Okay," Chris whispered. "What exactly are we looking for?" Ben pulled out his flashlight and scanned the room. "Anything that connects Graves to illegal activity." The warehouse was filled with metal shelves stacked with boxes. Some were marked with police evidence tags, likely cases that had been buried and forgotten. But one particular set of boxes caught Ben's eye. Marked with no official tags, they were tucked away in the corner. Ben knelt down and cracked one open. What he found made his blood run cold. Stacks of money. Unregistered firearms. Falsified police reports. This was it. Chris whistled low. "Oh, man. This is bad." Ben pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. "No, this is exactly what we needed." Then they heard it. A car door slamming outside. Chris swore under his breath. "We need to go. Now." Ben quickly grabbed a stack of papers, documents that looked like they detailed payoffs and bribes, and shoved them into his jacket. Then, without another word, they slipped out the side door, disappearing into the night just as headlights swept over the entrance. Ben didn't wait. By morning, he was standing outside Graves' office at the precinct, gripping the folder of evidence tightly. Chris had warned him against this, said it was reckless. But Ben didn't care. He was done playing defense. He pushed open the door. Graves was sitting behind his desk, looking as smug as ever. But when he saw Ben, his expression shifted. "Carter," he said slowly. "What do you want?" Ben threw the folder onto the desk. Recognize any of this? Graves casually flipped it open, barely glancing at the documents. I see a lot of papers, Carter. You're going to have to be more specific. Ben leaned in. Cut the act. We both know what this is. You've been running dirty deals for years, bribes, evidence tampering, illegal raids. You think you're untouchable. Graves smiled. And what do you plan on doing with this, so-called evidence? Ben's jaw clenched. I already sent copies to Internal Affairs. Delgado has everything. For the first time, Graves' smirk faltered. Ben pressed on. You've got two options, Graves. Either you go down fighting, or you cooperate and take a deal. But one way or another, you're done. Graves leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. Then, after a long moment, he sighed. You know, Carter, he said, his tone almost amused. You really don't know when to quit. Ben held his ground. Yeah. And that's exactly why I'm still standing. Within days, the department was in chaos. Graves had been taken into custody. Investigators were digging through years' worth of corrupt dealings, and officers who had been under his payroll were being called in for questioning. Ben sat at his desk, exhausted but relieved. Chris walked in, shaking his head. Man, I still can't believe you pulled that off. Ben chuckled. Neither can I. Chris dropped into the chair beside him. So, what now? Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. Now? We clean up the mess. Chris smirked. You mean you clean up the mess? I'm taking a vacation. Ben laughed. Yeah. You earned it. But as he watched the precinct around him, officers scrambling, cases being reopened, and Graves nowhere in sight, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And no matter how many Graves there were, he'd be ready. Because some fights were worth it.